you.
All righty. Go. So does everybody see this okay? Okay. Thought today for Education Sunday, we're going to be talking about Christian Zionism. And the question is, why are we talking about that? And the answer is because there's a resolution for World Church coming up opposing Christian Zionism. And so I thought that might be a useful thing to talk about. Matt had suggested that maybe we could, for Education Sunday, talk about some of the resolutions. It seemed like a good idea. And so I thought we'd take a look at Christian Zionism. It's one of those topics that lends itself to all kinds of things. And so like always, if we really wanted to get into this, we could spend hours and hours and hours talking about the implications and all the different things. So I'm going to go through it kind of quickly. And if there's, always encourage you to investigate it on your own if you want more information or ask questions, or we can discuss it or whatever. So, but since it's going to be something that the church is going to be voting on, I thought we could take a look at it so we knew what we were talking about a little bit. As always, resolutions have the whereases. And so the first statement, that whereas, as you know, is a statement of context and support for the resolution. The first one says the church holds the worth of persons, pursuit of peace and university and diversity, compassion and solidarity with the poor, the marginalized and the oppressed. That tells us that the issue here, at least from those who are putting the resolution in, that it's an issue of social justice. And that's why we need to oppose Christian Zionism, is because we're in the context of social justice. Second whereas says the church believes in the peaceful kingdom of God and a just Zion that will end poverty and oppression. So again, social justice is the issue here. Then here's the exact wording of the third whereas. We declare our belief in the love of God for Muslims and Jews, denounce Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, and state its commitment to the promotion of peace with justice in Palestine and Israel. That's from a World Church Resolution of 2016. And then Christian Zionism specifically is talking about that now in the fourth whereas, interpreting the Bible as saying that some must suffer before the return of Christ. It ignores the worth of all persons, excuses oppression, occupation, displacement, and colonization of Palestinians, and thereby hinders progress towards a just peace in the region. This is kind of the key criticism of Christian Zionism is right here, basically dealing with the impact that it's had on Palestinians from a social justice perspective. The fifth whereas says, in interpreting the establishment of Israel as a necessary precursor to the return of Jesus Christ, that's a misreading of the Bible and conflates the Israel of the Bible with the modern state of Israel. It's another important point. People who assume the modern state or country of Israel is exactly the same as the biblical Israel, and they're saying that's not the case, and that's a problem. And then finally, the last whereas says the church has renounced the doctrine of discovery and its highly contestable interpretations of colonization, but has not formally renounced narratives of Christian Zionism some members may have held and others may still hold. So it struck me as being something, a place to start talking about is what in the world is the doctrine of discovery and why are we concerned about colonization? Okay, and that's key to the whole thing. So I thought our first side trip was going to be in those two areas. So let's talk about colonization a little bit. And one way that I used this when I was teaching in class to talk about the impact of European colonization or colonialism. And I asked my students to consider what the world looked like in 1450, so 550 years ago. At that point, North and South America, Africa, and Oceania, the islands of the South Pacific, would have been completely defined by thriving indigenous cultures in 1450. Russia was a collection of small city-states and was of no particular power whatsoever. Europe was much smaller, considerably less powerful and wealthy, and key parts of their current culture didn't even exist. Almost none of the current culture existed at that point. The two wealthiest places in the world in 1450 was the Mali Kingdom in Africa, which was the wealthiest place in the world at that point, and the Chinese Empire. And so just from these snippets, you can tell the world was completely different than it is today. There's nothing even remotely like the world today. And the reason for bringing all this out is because the single thing that has made the world change from the 1450 world to the world we have today is European colonialism. It is the single most important factor in making the world the way it is today. Whether you like the world today or don't, it doesn't really matter, as European colonialism was the single most important factor in bringing about this world. So that's why it kind of dominates so many conversations in so many different ways. Imperialism is connected to colonization or colonialism, and it's important to note the 7 largest countries in the world today are, and this is in order of their size, Russia, Canada, China, United States, Brazil, Australia, and India. And all of these are imperial states. All of these grew as empires through territorial conquest and absorption of other nations into the empire. That's how you make a big country, is you go conquer other people and absorb them into your country. And so the basic structure of the power structure of the world today is imperial, or a result of colonization in the past. That means they grew so large by colonizing other nations, and that had a disastrous impact on indigenous people throughout the world, as well as on environmental quality of the world. So these two issues are directly linked to colonization and imperialism. Now, what's the doctrine of discovery? I took this information from the Cornell University Law School. So this is pretty much their language. The doctrine of discovery refers to a principle in public international law under which, when a nation discovers land, it directly acquires rights on that land. And the doctrine came up when European nations started discovering non-European lands. From the European perspective, that gave them the right to special rights to on this land, such as property and sovereignty. Sovereignty meaning being able to control the land, and property meaning you own that land now. And these are non-European lands that they have found through the age of discovery. The principle, of course, disregards the fact that the land often is already inhabited by other nations. And in fact, this doctrine was used in order to legitimize the colonization of lands outside of Europe. So you're always hearing about Europeans, claiming this land for the King of Spain or the King of France or the King of England or whoever, okay? And more broadly, introducing some more legal jargon here, the doctrine of discovery can be described as an international law doctrine giving authorization to explorers to claim terra nullius, which is a legal term, which means nobody's land, is the direct translation from Latin. So in other words, if you discover something which is nobody's land, then you can claim it and claim sovereignty over that land. And from a European point of view, indigenous people were nobody because they were not Christians. And so they were claiming this land under the principle of terra nullius, even though there were millions of people already living in the lands and so forth. And that's a problem, and it has been a problem, and one of the major issues of the 21st century world is the rights and the experience of indigenous people. So, and the Community of Christ has renounced this doctrine as incompatible with core beliefs of Christianity, primarily from a social justice point of view, in that indigenous people have had their rights severely curtailed, had massive genocidal depopulations as a result of this. And so it's problematical, to say the least. Of course, the interesting point about this, and this is something that we could spend hours talking about, but the point here is that all of those 7 major international countries, including the United States, were formed on this principle. And without this principle, none of us would exist. So the fact that we've denounced it is an interesting tension in terms of how rights and so forth go. So that's the doctrine of discovery. I thought I would pause here. Are there any comments or discussion or questions at this point? Yes, Chris.
All right, actually it's Matt.
So I think it's really interesting that we're talking about this particular topic the day before Columbus/Indigenous Peoples Day.
Well, that's not, well, it is coincidental, but it's also appropriate.
Apropos, yeah. So I just thought that was an interesting connection to our larger, that excellent choice on topics, Rich.
Well, I do my best, but it was coincidental. But of course, Matt's exactly right. The issue with Columbus Day is that Columbus discovered America and claimed it for, well, claimed at least part of it for the King of Spain, despite the fact there were millions of Native Americans here already. So some people say, no, we should not celebrate that because it was so, I mean, it was a 90 to 95% depopulation of indigenous people after the Europeans got here. And it's the largest genocide in human history occurred in the Americas after the Europeans got here. So why are we celebrating that? Other people say we should celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day and celebrate, I mean, so it's a complicated business. That's something else we can talk about at some other point. That's a much bigger topic.
Yeah.
So what happens with European imperialism and colonialism is it's basically defined as the establishment and maintenance of rule for an extended period of time by a sovereign power over subordinate people who are separate from the ruling power. It involves the physical settlement of people, are called settlers or colonists, from the imperial power to the colonial area. Okay, so in other words, people from the dominant country moves to the colonies, and what they do in that process is they have political and legal domination over other cultures, economic and political dependence of the colonies on the imperial power. In other words, the colonies are dependent on the imperial power and are subordinate to that. Almost always there's exploitive treatment by the imperial power of the colony with racial and cultural inequality and uneven economic benefits which benefits the imperial power at the expense of the colony. So the colony exists to funnel money and resources and often labor to the imperial power. That's why you have colonies. That's why this all happened. That's how Europe got to be so wealthy. That's how Europe got to be so powerful. They were looting the rest of the world, basically, of resources, money, and people. And that's how they got to be such a powerful thing. It's how all of this, that's how the world came to be structured the way it is today. It seems harsh because this is not exactly how we frame our own history usually, but this is, it's interesting to recall that the United States was an oppressed colony of England. And that's why we had a Revolutionary War, because we didn't want to be that anymore. And then the ironic part is once we got established as a country, we went about then oppressing the indigenous people all the way across the United States to California. So that's an interesting tension in American history, I think. So the terms are the imperial state is called the dominant country, the mother country, the colonial power. The exploited area is called the colony, and a colonist is somebody from the mother country who goes to live in the colony. And the colonists are expected to enforce the domination of the mother country over the indigenous native peoples of the colony. And the basis for all of that is the doctrine of discovery. Okay, so that's a little bit about that. Real quickly, there are multiple phases of colonization. If we looked at a map from 1750s, by that point, You can see that most of the colonization took place in the Americas. So all the gold color is Spain's domination of Latin America. The green is Portuguese domination of what is today Brazil. The red is, England, which this is what becomes the United States here. This is what is the roots of Canada up here. The blue is France, which had a very large empire in North America by that point. Excuse me. And if you know your history, you know just a few years later, the French and Indian War was fought, a brutal and really destructive war was fought in the United States, or in North America, between the French and the British. And at the whole point of that war was who was going to dominate North America, who's going to get this land, you know. And both the French and the English wanted it, and they didn't want to share it. So they both wanted it, and they fought this war. The English won, which is why I'm talking to you in English today instead of French, and why we're not a Catholic church, because that was the issues were both linguistic and religious, as well as cultural and in terms of economic domination. So the French lost all of this except for Quebec. That's the only thing they held on to, and that's why Quebec today is a French-speaking Catholic area, but it's the only one in North America. So that's it. You can see Africa was little done, some coastal areas of European colonization, almost entirely 100% for the to capture and exploit slaves. That's what this was all about. You note that Russia expanded dramatically across Asia, and almost all of Siberia came under the control of Russia at that time. So this is long, of course, before the communists. This is under the czars. And one other thing to point out is the Turkish Empire, which is the dark gray, all the way up into Europe and all through the Middle East. This is important in giving rise to the current structure of the Middle East, which is going to be part of our discussion a little bit later on. I've got to get going here because I'm doing this like a lecture, and I shouldn't be doing it that way. But the second period of historical colonization, by this time, the United States has spread all the way across to California and taken Alaska as well. Almost all of what is today Latin America has become independent from Spain and Portugal, but Africa is the key player in the second phase. This is 1914, on the eve of World War I. Virtually all of Africa were colonies at that point. Much of Southeast Asia was colonies by that point. And then Russia had reached its largest extent ever. Again, this is before the communists got there. So the communists added virtually no land to the Soviet Union at all. It was just already there. The czars had already taken all of this, including all of Ukraine. They'd already conquered all of Ukraine at that point. So that's kind of the second phase of all this. World War I changed everything. World War II changed things even more. And so all of this changed after World War II, as almost all of Africa became independent, almost all of Southeast Asia became independent. And of course, eventually the Soviet Union fell in place of Russia. Okay, real quick, that was too much. And before we get started, I want to make a caveat. I want to make sure we say this. It is very common in the United States right now for people who might support Palestinian rights or criticize any of the policies of the country of Israel to interpret that as anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish feeling, you know, because Israel is a fundamental, basically a Jewish state. Now we have to be very clear about this, that criticizing the policies of the state of Israel is a political statement, not a religious one, and is not a marker necessarily of anti-Semitism. So it's okay to criticize Israel and still support Jewish rights and privileges, okay? And we got to make sure we keep that, because a lot of people confuse that, and they accuse anybody who criticizes any of Israel's policies as being anti-Semitic. And that's the same thing is true for the support of the Palestinian people. And it's important to do this because Christians have a really long, kind of shameful history of anti-Semitism towards Jews. And we want to make sure we're clear about what that really means. Okay, and how that is not the issue when you want to criticize something that the Jewish, the Israeli state does as a state policy. Is that clear? Does everybody have any comments about that?
Rich, I really appreciate that you did make that distinction. That was helpful for me. So thank you.
Good. So what about, we're talking about Zionism here, Christian Zionism. Now let's talk about Zionism in general, okay? So where does Zion come from in the Bible? What is the biblical Zion? In the Bible, basically Zion refers to a specific hill, a low mountain. And that's what Zion is. It's Mount Zion. And you hear that a lot in the scriptures. And you hear people talking about Mount Zion. As it turns out, though, Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, was built on that hill, plus another hill. And so Zion also came to specifically refer to Jerusalem. So you see Zion used in the Bible to refer to Jerusalem as a city, as well as to the hill, okay? And because Jerusalem overwhelmingly dominated Israel, then Zion has also come to mean, in general, the whole area of Israel. So in some uses, it kind of means all of Israel, okay? And that's how Zionism uses the term, is to refer to all of Israel. In the New Testament, the meaning of Zion is expanded to include the heavenly city of God. So it's referred to as Zion in Revelation and so forth. Now there's some scriptures here to illustrate those points. I don't think we'll take time to go through all these scriptures right here, but there's a bunch of scriptures relating to Zion. A lot of them, some of them refer to the hill, some to the city, some to the country, some to the heavenly city. Okay, so it's used in all those ways. The way we're going to use it now, and of course, this is, of course, obviously, I'm not telling you guys anything, an extremely important concept in our particular faith community, where it mostly means this, the heavenly city of God. That's how we, or something related to that anyway. But today we're mostly going to use it here to talk about Israel. Okay, and that's what Zionism kind of refers to as Israel. We mentioned this, I think, once before, but after the Jewish revolt against the Roman Empire, which started in the late 60s AD, about 30 or so years after Jesus, the Romans crushed that revolt ruthlessly and drove the Jews out of Israel. That's the red lines that you see on this map here. All the red lines are the Jews being driven out of Israel. That's called the diaspora. And that's important when you talk about Zionism, is understanding the diaspora. The black lines are all the subsequent migrations the Jews made, and mostly they ended up here in Eastern Europe. This is where most of the Jews ended up. They were driven out of these countries through anti-Semitic policies, and they ended up over here in Eastern Europe. Okay. So by the time you get to the 20th century, the 19th and 20th century, almost all the Jews in the world are here in the eastern part of Europe. So in the 19th century, the term Zionism was coined to describe the hope of some Jews to immigrate from the diaspora, from this scattered all around the world, to go back to Israel. Okay, and this became a movement amongst Jews, not all Jews, but for a lot of Jews, to go back to Israel. In the Passover or on Sabbath, Jews often say next year in Jerusalem. That was a way of saying we haven't forgotten that Israel's out there, despite the fact they were saying that in Russia or Germany or the United States or wherever they were. And this strongly suggests that they were going to reestablish a homeland for Jews in Israel, basically establishing the country of Israel, which in the 20th century is a country that hadn't existed for 2,000 years. Okay, but they still had that longing to go back to Israel, at least some Jews, not all, but some. And at that time, the area was known as Palestine and was inhabited by Palestinians who were overwhelmingly Muslim. Okay, so the Jews were thinking about going back to a country which was already occupied and had been for 2,000 years by Palestinians. Okay, there was no livable place there that wasn't occupied, is what I'm trying to say. So what are the implications of this idea of Zionism? It basically negates the Jewish life in the diaspora. Zionists at least believed that the experience of being Jewish, if you wanted to do it authentically, you had to go back to Israel. Okay, and you couldn't be an authentic Jew in Europe or North America or wherever you happened to be in the diaspora. You need to go back to Israel. This kind of offended some people who didn't like Zionism, who were Jewish, who didn't like Zionism, because they said we're just perfectly fine as Jews here, wherever we happen to be. There was a conflict there. But another big part of this was the principle of self-determination. Again, we can't say it too often. Jews had been unbelievably persecuted by Christians for 1,000 years at this point, by the 20th century. And the idea was to have a place where Jews could decide for themselves how they lived without persecution, without having other people tell them how to live. You know, they wanted to determine their own fate in their own way, which is one of the United Nations human rights, which has been enshrined by the United Nations. I think we would all agree to that. That a group of people should be able to determine for themselves how to live and not be told by others how to do that, you know. So this began in the 19th century, but really accelerated in the 20th century, largely in response to the Holocaust. And we'll see that in a minute. Now, complicating this whole thing was World War I. The Turks were on the side of the Germans in World War I. And so when that side lost, the winners, Britain and France mostly, carved up the Turkish Empire that we saw, that gray area we saw before on the map, carved up that empire between them. And some of them became British colonies and some became French colonies. And Palestine became a British colony after 1919, after the World War I was over. And they really hated the idea of Zionism. The British really hated the idea of Zionism because they could see it was just going to cause nothing but problems. And so they really strictly did not want to do that. If you're familiar at all with the book or the movie called Exodus, it's all about this. It's all about the British trying to keep the Jews from coming to Palestine in the period of time before World War II. And Jewish Zionists were outraged by that, and they waged a war against the British in the 1930s, including a terrorism against the British in an act of national liberation to try to drive the British out of Israel or out of Palestine so they could have a chance to establish Israel. So that's all part of that story too. Now, a lot of Jews responded enthusiastically to Zionism, and there was a steady trickle of Jews into Palestine for the first half of the 20th century. The numbers are in 1914, about 8% of the total population of Palestine was Jewish. 92% of it was Palestinian, okay? But after World War II, that really accelerated. The Holocaust really created the image of the world that the Jews had to have someplace to protect themselves because of the amazing horrors of the Holocaust. So in 1946, which is the year after World War II is over, about 30% of the population of Palestine was Jewish, but in 2 years' time, that jumped to 82%. As massive numbers of Jews came to Palestine after World War II, but also what happened by 1948 is an awful lot of the Palestinians had been driven out of Palestine. So the 82% reflects not only incoming of Jews, but the leaving of Palestinians. Palestinians largely were driven out by 1948 and concentrated in refugee camps located here on the West Bank. And it's called the West Bank because this is the Jordan River right there. And so it's on the West Bank of the Jordan River. Okay, so it's probably important to keep that in mind because water is the most important issue in the West Bank. And the Jordan River supplies virtually all of the water for the West Bank. And then the Gaza Strip. So they were big refugee camps of Palestinians after they'd been driven out of Israel. And it was in 1948 that the country of Israel was formed by UN mandate. And so the Jews had their homeland, they had their country, but the Palestinians were living in rather squalid and difficult refugee camps in West Bank and Gaza Strip as a result of being driven out. Okay, so now other Jews around the world rejected Zionism. They said we can be Jews right where we're living right now, you know, in the United States or Europe or Asia or wherever we happen to be. And it's for that reason that New York City is the largest population of Jews of any city in the world even today, with almost twice as many Jews as is found in Jerusalem. And in fact, of the top 10 cities in the world to have, in terms of Jewish population, 5 are in the United States. That's New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Boston, and San Francisco. Only 3 of those top 10 are in Israel. So Jerusalem is the second, Tel Aviv is the fourth, and Rishon LeZion is ninth. Those are in terms of Jewish populations of cities. So that's an indication that not all the Jews bought into Zionism. They stayed, you know, where they were in the diaspora. Also, Paris, France, and Buenos Aires are on the top 10 as well. So what are the perspectives on Zionism? Well, those who support it usually say it's a national liberation movement for the repatriation of persecuted people to their ancestral homeland, which gives them a chance to live lives of freedom without persecution. And that's all definitely has basis in truth. There's no doubt that's all basically true. Those who reject Zionism usually do so because of the inherent colonial nature of the Jews coming back. The doctrine of discovery basically is what's there. You know, they basically say we're coming back and discovering this land, and who cares if there's people living here, you know. So it's colonial, and for human rights for the displaced Palestinians. That's why people reject Zionism. And they're also right. And this is the complication of all of this. The problem with Zionism is that Palestine was already inhabited by Palestinians. And to accommodate the Jews, at least some, actually almost all of those Palestinians were relocated. And they had been living on that land for thousands of years. So another critical issue is water. The area is very dry and is underserved with water. The Jordan River is the dominant source of water for everybody. And both the Jews and the Palestinians want land which allows them to have access to reliable water. You know, and that's usually the same land, and they both want the same land. You know, that's the problem. So what makes this such an intractable problem, so difficult to solve, is that both sides are right and both sides are wrong. And I thought we should go through and look at the different issues to show the sides of the Jews and the Palestinians in terms of Israel and Zionism and Palestine. Okay, so Israel and Palestine, the Jewish claim to religion to Israel is a religious claim. So Judaism holds that Abraham, you know this story, made a covenant with God about 4,000 years ago. If the Jews obey the commandments of God, the descendants of Abraham would be given land that is now Israel as a promised land. And Jews believe they're descendant from Abraham's son Isaac, and Jerusalem is the most holy site in all the world. And this is all true. I mean, this is all the stuff that you can say, yeah, it's right there in the Bible, you know. But the Palestinian claim to Israel is also religious, because the Arabs also believe that Allah, which is the same God as the God of Israel, okay, we got to make sure that's clear. We're talking about the same God in both cases, made a covenant with Abraham, which they call Ibrahim, and Islam holds that Abraham is one of the greatest of all prophets. And the Arabs believe they're descendants of Abraham's son Ishmael. So they have just as strong claim to Abraham as the Jews do. In fact, Muhammad is considered to be a direct descendant of Ishmael. Jerusalem is also the third most holy site in all of Islam after Mecca and Medina. And in fact, in the early times in Islam, Muhammad had their, as you know, Muslims today pray facing Mecca. Originally, they didn't. Originally, they prayed facing Jerusalem. And that only changed later on. So, Jerusalem's a really holy place for Muslims as well. So it's kind of an equal claim in terms of a religious claim. What about the legal claim? Well, the United Nations mandated a Jewish state in Palestine in 1948. So from international law point of view, Israel has a right to exist. But at the same time, the United Nations mandated a Palestinian state in Palestine in 1948. So there should be a Palestine country there, because the United Nations said there was going to be a Palestine country. It never formed because of a war that was fought between the Jews and Arabs, and all the Arabs were driven out of the area. So Palestine never got to form, despite the UN mandate to form a country of Palestine. No, that was later. So they both have equal legal, international law claim to this land. And again, we can't stress too strongly, it's the same land that they have claim to. Okay. What about practical occupation of the land? Well, the Jews have lived in this area for many, many generations, a long time ago, but they lived there for 2,000 years or so, maybe 1,500 years after the Exodus from Egypt, and they lived in that area and so forth. And since 1947, it's been overtly Jewish. And we had the country of Israel, and that's what, 70 some years at this point. And they've built that up into a modern, well-functioning state. So it's practical, from practical points of view and occupation points of view, the Jews had that land. But the Palestinian claim to Israel, they also have occupied that land continuously for almost all of 2,000 years until they were forced to leave in the late 1940s. So they also have a heritage of living in that land, which is equally strong to that of the Jews. So again, everybody's right and everybody's wrong. That's the problem with this whole thing. This is why it's so hard to solve. What about morality? The Jewish claim to Israel from a morality point of view is they've been systematically persecuted by Christians for the past 1,000 years. The horrific genocide of during World War II, 6 million Jews were killed, and in response to that, and that's an extremely strong moral argument, right? So the UN formed the country of Israel as a place where the Jews could escape persecution. That all makes sense. But the Palestinian claim to Israel from a more morality point of view is that since 1948, they were forcibly removed from the land they'd occupied for thousands of years, been forced to live in squalid and overcrowded refugee camps. The Israelis have inflicted humiliating treatment on them, curfews, limiting access to resources, low-paying jobs, limited mobility and basic rights, such as speech and gathering and so forth. All of that has been curtailed, and they need a state for their own protection, right? They need a place that they can call their own. It's the same claim that Israel has, basically. There wasn't the genocide against Palestinians as there was against the Jews. That gives the Jews a pretty strong claim from a morality point of view. What about security? Jews feel they need a place for the place of safety after the last 1,000 years. Some Palestinians, a minority, have used terrorist tactics against Israel, in some cases killing civilians. So there's a continued need for security, right? Palestinian claim to Israel from the security point of view, they've been denied basic rights of expression and have no way to affect change through the normal political process. So inevitably, a small minority has adopted extra legal means, in other words, terrorist means. The Israeli response is far out of proportion, however. Way more Palestinians have been killed by Israelis than Israelis have been killed by Palestinians. So the Palestinians need a place where they can escape refugee camps and feel safe in their own land. So they have a security issue as well. To put all this together, this is why this problem hasn't been solved. So here's maps, got to have maps, right? By 1948, Israel was established as a state. Jews lived in the black areas here, or this is probably should be 47, the year before. Jews lived in the black areas and Palestinians dominated the yellow areas. This is the UN plan. In 1947, the UN put forth this plan to have the blue area become the nation of Israel for Jews, the green area become the nation of Palestine for Palestinians. And again, countries, we're talking about real countries here. So a country of Israel, a country of Palestine. And Jerusalem, it doesn't really show on this map, but Jerusalem was split between the two, since they both have considered Jerusalem to be holy. So West Jerusalem was Jewish, East Jerusalem was Muslim or Palestinian. Now this didn't happen, and so after the 1948 war, Israel was the blue country, and Palestinians were mostly here in the West Bank and here in Gaza, okay, in refugee camps. So since that time, in 1967, during the Six-Day War, in which the Israelis launched a war against their Arab neighbors, the Israelis occupied the West Bank. They just took it over. They took over the Gaza Strip. They also took over the Golan Heights, which is not really part of our discussion here. That's Syrian. That's Syria, not Palestinians. And when they took over this area, they annexed it and claimed it. And what that meant was they took over all of the Palestinian refugees as well. So then they had to have a Palestinian refugee policy. How are they going to deal with all these Palestinian refugees, which were still living in refugee camps in the West Bank and Gaza Strip 20 years after they'd been driven there? Now, to solidify their claims to these areas, the Israelis started moving settlers, colonists, into these areas. They started building towns and putting settlers into these areas. And of course, that brought them into conflict with the Palestinians who were already there. And again, we can't say too often, the Jordan River right here is the primary water source for all of this. And of course, the West Bank is critical in controlling the Jordan River. So here's the West Bank, okay, a close-up of it. And all of the red triangles and all of the blue squares are Israeli towns which have been built there since 1967. And there's over about 100 of them at this point, and 400,000 Israelis now live in the West Bank. That's the colonists that went into that area. Palestinian towns are like Nablus and Tulkarm and so forth are located on there as well. Jericho, Bethlehem, Hebron, these are all Palestinian areas. And basically Israel acted according to the doctrine of discovery. They went in here assuming terra nullius applied. And this is the issue that a lot of people have with the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, okay? Now, from the Israeli point of view, remember, they felt this was necessary to ensure Israel's security, okay? The black line, by the way, that you see all along here is a giant wall that the Israel has built to separate the Palestinians of the West Bank from the Jews of Israel. Okay, so there's a giant wall that goes along this. In some cases, it has cut off Palestinians from being able to see other Palestinians, you know, because of the wall. This is what the wall looks like. Here's part of it. Here's another part of it. So you get the idea. This is while they're building it. So the Palestinians, of course, want their own state. They want their own place where they can be Palestinians and have their own country, right? Historically, Israel has strongly opposed this. They don't like that idea. They don't want to give up land or control of water to the Palestinians. And they view an independent country of Palestine as a threat to their security. Now, in 1993, Israel agreed to acknowledge the Palestine Liberation Organization and to give limited Palestinian autonomy in the occupied territories. So the Palestinians have more ability to control their own destiny a little bit in these areas. And in return, the PLO acknowledged that Israel has a right to exist as a country. This was a big step forward. And in 2005, Israel simply gave up the Gaza Strip to the Palestinians. They just said, we're done with the Gaza. You know, we're not going to do that anymore. But that by itself is not an acceptable homeland or state for the Palestinians for all these reasons. One, denies Palestine access to Jerusalem, which is important to the Muslims because it's holy. It cuts off the Palestinians from the Jordan River, which is over here, okay, it's way too small to accommodate all the Palestinians. The Gaza Strip's only 139 square miles, and that's 1/7 the size of Grant County, Wisconsin. So that's really a small area. It's not big enough to hold all the Palestinians, and it doesn't have enough resources to sustain a state. Okay, so if there's going to be a nation of Palestine, it has to include the West Bank, at least the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Probably more would be better, but at least that much. And Israel does not want to do that, give up the West Bank, because they want guaranteed access to the Jordan River over here. They want unimpeded access to Jerusalem, which sits right on the boundary here between the two. They want more space in the West Bank to settle more colonists there. And they see it as a security issue. So they don't want to give up the West Bank, and they're digging their heels in on that, okay? Now, finally, we get to Christian Zionism after all that background. Okay. What is the definition of Christian Zionism? And it's complicated, but it's the belief among some Christians that the return of the Jews to the Holy Land and the establishment of the state of Israel in 1948 were in accord to biblical prophecy and is an indicator of the end times. Almost all people who buy this say that started the process of the end times. The apocalypse, Revelation, all that kind of stuff started when the Jews returned to Israel. And so they're seeing them as they see themselves as living in the end times. And this has had a profound impact on the theology and the practice of a lot of these Christians. This is kind of an old idea. You can date precursors to this back to the 1500s. And it was usually called Christian Restorationism until World War II. And then after that, Christian Zionism became the more commonly used term. So in the last 60, 70 years, it's been Christian Zionism. And we're going to focus on that recent expression, not do a historical, romp through that, because it's had really strong impact on both politics and theology in the United States. It's really changed how we've seen the Middle East. Donald Trump, for example, was influenced by Christian Zionism when he moved the US Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which was a controversial move. We're one of the very few countries in the world that have an embassy in Jerusalem. Almost all of them are in Tel Aviv. And he moved it to Jerusalem because of Christian Zionism. So it's having impact in politics. And this is by far and away strongest in the evangelical church. 2017 poll, 80% of all evangelical Christians believe that the creation of Israel in 1948 was the fulfillment of biblical prophecy that would bring about the return of Jesus to the earth. So that's pretty much all evangelicals buy that. It's by far the way strongest Christian Zionism, strongest in the United States, which is due to the unusual amount of influence the evangelical religion has on US culture. And it's growing in importance in Africa, where evangelical Christianity is increasing in that region as well. Now, the influence of evangelical religion in general in the United States really accelerated in the 1970s. And has continued to expand to the present time. And as a result, the influence of Christian Zionism grew in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and getting stronger and stronger as you go in succeeding decades. So one of the things that helped drive the rise of evangelicalism, two things. One, the Roe versus Wade decision in 1972, which just overturned. That's another triumph of Christian Zionism, by the way, is the overturning of Roe versus Wade, or of evangelical influence, I should say. But a major influence on the rise of evangelicalism in the 1970s were books, fiction books that came out. The most important probably being The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey, came out in 1970, which I have read. This is an interpretation of the end times based on then current geopolitics and economics from an evangelical point of view. And the restoration of Israel, Christian Zionism, played a very important part in all that. The book was unbelievably popular. It's the best-selling nonfiction book in the United States for the entire decade of the 1970s. For 10 years, it was the best-selling nonfiction book. And I put nonfiction in quotes because so much of it is made up that it's hard to say whether it's nonfiction or fiction. But they used current countries and events to try to justify this. But by itself, it helped to drive the rise of evangelical religion in the United States in the 1970s. The other thing that really gave it a big boost, Christian Zionism especially, was the Left Behind series of books and movies. And they were published as 16 books in the series, published between 1995 and 2007. Every one of them were bestsellers. And there's a kids series of Left Behind books, and there are 4 major movies have been made off these books, the last from 2014. And these books are about the end times and the apocalypse based on a rather contested evangelical interpretation of the book of Revelations. And the restoration of Israel, Christian Zionism, is a fundamental marker, important element in these books. And these were enormously popular amongst evangelicals. And their influence stretched into politics and economics as well. Okay, so this kind of helped drive that as well. Okay. What about the Jews' relationship to God from a Christian Zionist point of view? This whole thing depends on what's called evangelical dispensational belief that the Jews are still in special covenantal relationship with God. Now, dispensationalism is again, a 10-hour topic that we're going to condense into 10 seconds here. But dispensationalism basically says that history is divided into multiple dispensations. Like God does this at this time, then God does this at another time, then God does this at another time. And they believe, almost without exception, in premillennialism. That means a 1,000-year reign of Jesus on earth before the final judgment, and in a rapture that will occur before the second coming of Jesus. That's all part of dispensationalism. And Christian Zionism comes out of that same theological idea. The 2 most important evangelical leaders since 1980 have been Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson. Both assume this covenant relationship and both accept Christian Zionism. Falwell, for example, said, "To stand against Israel is to stand against God. We believe that history and sculpture proves that God deals with nations in relation to how they deal with Israel." So in other words, Israel gets to do whatever they want, basically, according to Falwell, because they're in a special covenantal relationship with God, and you can't go against that. The Third International Christian Zionist Congress, held in Jerusalem, said this. Okay, so this gives you a kind of a synopsis of this. The modern ingathering of the Jewish people to Eretz Israel, that's the land of Israel, and the rebirth of the nation of Israel are in fulfillment of biblical prophecies as written in both the Old and New Testaments. Christian believers are instructed by Scripture to acknowledge the Hebraic roots of their faith and to actively assist and participate in the plan of God for the ingathering of the Jewish people and the restoration of the nation of Israel in our day. In other words, we're supposed to help Israel do this if we're true Christians because of this interpretation of the Scriptures. Okay, everybody see that? This is a key idea. So the large majority of evangelicals accept Christian Zionism, and they usually mean that it's an unqualified support for the state of Israel. So here's this guy, Christians for Israel. You know, basically, we just will do whatever Israel wants to do. It's fine. Christians say they support Israel because it's important in fulfilling the prophecy that Jesus will return to the earth. They feel that not supporting Israel is the same as rejecting Scripture, which they usually see as being inerrant, right? And is the same as rebelling against God, because God has chosen Israel as a covenant people. So if you don't support the current nation of Israel, the current state of Israel, then you're going against God and you're rejecting Scripture. Okay. So in other words, the majority, not without exception, But the majority of evangelicals and Christian Zionists make no distinction between the theological assumption of the Jews as a chosen people, which is a biblical concept, and the political policies and actions of the state of Israel. In other words, it's all the same thing. And that's an outgrowth of equating the biblical Israel with the modern state of Israel. So they support taking Palestinian lands from it by Israel, the forced colonization of that land, and the violence it takes to maintain Israeli control. They support all that. Okay. And this is where they part company with our church, which has argued that's not appropriate. Okay. Now, are Christian Zionists anti-Semitic? Despite this unqualified support for Israel, they have been accused of anti-Semitism. Not only historically, they have a strong tradition of anti-Semitism in the past, but fundamental to their beliefs is that the restoration of Israel will lead to the end times, and during the end times, the Jews will realize the error of their ways and will accept Christianity in mass conversions. This is fundamental to Christian Zionism. And to all those, to Late Great Planet Earth and to Left Behind, all of those things have the same thing. The Jews realize they're wrong and they need to become Christians and they get mass conversions. So that assumes that Judaism is at best an incomplete religion and at worst a false, diluted religion, and overtly calls for its elimination through conversion to Christianity. It's kind of easy to see how that might be anti-Semitic. You know, they have to become Christians, become real people, or be saved, or whatever. So that's another issue. Okay. Now, there's lots and lots and lots of Christian churches that reject Christian Zionism. Lots of them. In fact, the majority do. Roman Catholic, Orthodox, mainstream Protestant, all reject Christian Zionism, and usually for two reasons. One, the theology under it is suspect, to say the least. It's a very distorted understanding of the scripture, they say, and the inherent human rights problems for Palestinians. So as an example, the Reformed Church of America says the ideology of Christian Zionism and the extreme form of dispensationalism that undergirds it is a distortion of the biblical message and is an impediment to achieving a just peace in Israel and Palestine. And that's typical of what all these churches believe. Now, our church has not gone on record on this issue. That's what this resolution is trying to get them to do. Okay, to join with these people, you know, and that's what the church will be asked to vote on, whether we're going to do that or not. So here's questions to think about. Oh, it's 11:30. Questions to think about, a bunch of them, and we can discuss these as long as you want to stay. If you have to go, of course, we have to go. But is it possible to reject policies of the state of Israel without being anti-Semitic? Is it possible to reject policies of the state of Israel without rejecting the scriptures? What are the political, social, cultural, economic implications of Christian Zionism? Was the establishment of Israel colonization or colonialism? Are the policies of Israel towards the Palestinians colonialism? Is there ever a situation in which colonialism is justified? Those are all questions people fuss about in this issue. Should there be a state of Palestine along with the state of Israel? What would that look like? How would that come about? Would a Palestinian state promote or destroy the prospects of peace in that area? And then, of course, the fundamental question that we're asking at this point is, should the community of Christ reject any historical complicity in narratives of Christian Zionism? And that's what we're going to be asked to vote on at World Conference. So we'll see what the church ends up doing on this issue. And that's all I got. We can talk about any of these questions if you want, or it's 11:30, so it's probably time to go. But it's up to you. Comments or questions or observations? Boy, I'm sorry I was going pretty fast there, but.
Just want to thank you, Rich, for it. This was really helpful to phrase and shape the context of the resolution. So I think this has been a good conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to do any more resolution-based education things, because the rest of them are things like supporting marriage and things like that. And I'm not sure you want to hear me talk for an hour about marriage or things like that, or communion and things like that. So I probably won't do any more, but these two, the one on refugees and the one on Christian Zionism, seem to lend itself to this kind of thing. So
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Rich. Lots to think about.
yeah,
Yes, it is.
there always is, isn't there?
Giving me an idea for the next one.
Oh, tell me. I want to know. I love suggestions from everybody about Education Sunday. So
I would, go ahead, Judy.
I was just gonna say, I've been hearing a lot of things about the end days and the rapture and what's coming and the second coming and what all that means. And I'm thinking, what do the books of Revelation tell us? I've never really understood all that.
oh, I've got it all down. I'll tell you. It's easy. No, I'm just kidding. I'm joking, of course. That would be an interesting conversation to have. It's again one of those topics that's going to be multiple hours,
Yeah.
but because it's really complicated. But yeah, it is fascinating. It really is. I'm not going to go into it now. I have worked that out in my own mind, how that works, but that doesn't mean I'm right. But I'd be happy to share a little bit, and we can all share together, because it's speculative. It's designed to be speculative, and so we can share that together if you like at some point.
And I do think that because of the situation in the world today and the way things are going, I think people are looking at
Yeah,
the end.
I think you're right. People are thinking apocalypse. So it might be a trendy thing. Not trendy, appropriate topic.
I think a way to frame this up, Rich, would be to talk about apocalyptic literature and the idea and concepts of apocalyptic literature, of which Revelation is one of them.
Yeah. So is Daniel.
The other one I think to put on your radar is you mentioned dispensationalism.
Yeah, that goes along with the end times.
So
But
yeah,
dispensationalism is a larger topic that you can talk about without talking about the end times, and talk about the previous dispensations. And it's an evangelical idea. It's not something our church has ever accepted, I don't think. And most churches don't, I don't think, but evangelicals love it. And we've got to acknowledge that evangelical Christianity is very, very influential in the United States. Yeah. Both religiously, politically, and to some degree economically, but certainly religiously and politically. And so what they believe and think is important to know, because it helps identify some of the things that are happening in the United States. So
again, thank you, Rich. I'm going to stop the
Sure.
recording now.
Yeah.